Well, we are in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. If you know where Psalms and Proverbs are, just go a little bit more, and it's right past that. The title of this new series that we are starting today is When All Seems Meaningless. So that's the overall title of the series, and it's not because I'm lazy, but because I just didn't want to think about it, which I guess is laziness. That's the title of my sermon today, too. So if you're taking notes, When All Seems Meaningless, we're going to look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. As you're turning there, let me say some introductory things. This is a book about mankind's endless search for meaning and the answers to life's biggest questions. Why are things the way that they are? Why do these things happen and not those things? What is the purpose of it all? And how should we live in a world that is so predictable or unpredictable and confusing? This book is one man's attempt to answer those questions as he searches for meaning and purpose in this life. In this first sermon of the series, I want to just start with some introductory information about the book itself, the author, the overall message. I don't think I have to work too hard at that because that's what the author does in these first 11 verses. So I want to start just by reading the first 11 verses. It's an opening poem, and then we'll go from there. This is Ecclesiastes 1 to 11. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they will flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to be among those who come after. Welcome to church this morning, everybody. You know, no matter who you are, no matter what culture you come from, what time period you live in, all of us long to understand the world in which we live. We want to know ourselves more. We want to know the world better. When I was growing up, I don't know, maybe I was a different kind of kid. I don't really think I was. I remember thinking a lot about why things are the way that they are. I remember thinking about this world and how it didn't make sense to me. And I can give example over example, but it's the common things. And as I grew up, because I did not have a relationship with God in this sort of pursuit of meaning and understanding, I actually grew pretty hopeless. And that hopelessness led to, well, for me, sort of a hedonistic lifestyle. I just decided to, whatever, I can't figure it all out. I'll just give in to whatever I want to do. And I think a lot of people do that, where I just live for momentary pleasure and the perpetual escape from a confusing world. And that, of course, changed when I became a Christian, obviously for the better, but there were also some things that increased in my confusion when I became a Christian, and we'll talk about that later on. But maybe you can relate with that a little bit. Perhaps you also can understand what it's like to wrestle with a world that often doesn't make sense to you. And if you reflect on it for a moment, you can see how you also did not respond in ways that were right because you didn't know. And even still, you wonder, what is the right response to this stuff? at least from the start, we have good news. The good news is that we have something in common with the author of this book because he feels the exact same way as you and I do. As you can see from the start, he doesn't appear optimistic. Instead, before he even begins to describe his journey, which is really what the whole book is about, his journey of discovery, of meaning and purpose, he tells us right away, the beginning, this big conclusion of his research, and it's this: all is vanity. This word vanity is a major theme through the book, if you are familiar with it. It's used 5 times in this opening verse, and then it's used in 29 other verses in the book. And I think the word is often synonymously taken to mean words like meaningless or pointless. And though there are definitely some contexts where that word means that, the more common use of that word, the Hebrew word hebel, is translated better as mist or vapor or breath. So what the author is saying here right in the beginning, in this opening line that's very provocative, I mean, he's trying to gain an audience with this opening phrase. And he essentially says this, that though there is so much about life that is confusing, there is one thing that is for sure, which is this: life is short. It is here and gone. It's like a mist, a vapor, and a breath. In fact, everything is vanity. Nothing lasts. Nothing stands forever, which is part of the problem in our search for ultimate meaning and purpose in life. If nothing lasts, then what does it matter what we do or don't do? This is the tension, right, that all of us live in. This is the tension that the author was living in light of this conclusion that all is vanity, that nothing lasts forever. So that's how the book starts. All is vanity. And I want to come back to that, but I want to pause for a moment there because I think we need to back up and consider something that's very important, which is the author. After all, who is this pessimistic person? Who is this ancient philosopher who is thinking deep about life and its complexities? People wonder who wrote this book. Well, in general, there are 3 views as to who the author of Ecclesiastes was. I mean, we read there in verse 1, we're given a clue. Look at it again. It says, "These are the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." So we at least know somewhat of a time period. This isn't back in the days of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This isn't the days of Moses. This is after David's reign. This is at some point in the time of the kings. So we know the time period. But who was the preacher? Well, what we can see right there in verse 1, that there is an editor, there's a narrator, there's someone who is communicating someone else's words, the words of the preacher. And this preacher, the writer says, was the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. So one view is this, that the preacher and the writer are the same person. And the writer is writing in the third person as the preacher, and that person is Solomon, who is the son of David, the wisest king who ever lived. And because this is considered wisdom literature, bada bing, bada boom, it must be Solomon. That's the conclusion. But there's some problems with this view because even though the first couple of chapters seem to line up with Solomon's life that we know from the historical books, the rest of the book doesn't really line up with Solomon's life. So it doesn't really make sense. Furthermore, it doesn't actually say that this was Solomon in the beginning. It just says it's a son of David. So another view is that this was just another king that came later on in the line of David. So a further son of David, someone who came later. And we're not exactly sure who this king was and who the writer was, which takes me to a third option. It's one that I personally agree with, that the author or the editor of this book is an anonymous person. We have no idea who it is. But he's writing a story using a Solomon-like character to tell this story about life in a very confusing world, life under the sun. A way to understand it would be like this, like the author of a play or a screenwriter, where the preacher is the main character, and what we see is the words of the preacher. That's what we hear, that's what we see, that's what the main character is saying, but actually the preacher is just a voice for the one who actually wrote the script. which is the writer. The reason why I think this makes sense is because if this was Solomon, then why didn't the author state that this was Solomon, like he does in Proverbs, like he does in Song of Songs, Song of Solomon? Instead, it's left ambiguous. To argue hard and fast that it was Solomon is really an argument from silence, because it doesn't say that. Another reason why I think this is because the contents, again, don't follow the life of Solomon perfectly. Now, the author certainly uses Solomon-like events and wisdom and themes, but more than likely, this was just an anonymous author using a known character to tell a familiar story about life under the sun. But one thing I think we need to know for sure about this author, the writer of this book, is that though he is passionately in pursuit of knowing and understanding the meaning of life, he is doing so with this foundational principle that God exists and works providentially in time and space. That's his starting point. I bring this up because there are some who think, because he seems so pessimistic, this guy must not believe in God. That's why he's so confused. After all, once you believe in God, everything makes sense, right? Right? Everything makes sense to you now that you believe in God? No. That's not true. Some wrongly assume that the preacher didn't believe in God, therefore that's why he is so confused and agitated with life in this world. However, as we will see, again, this is far from true. This man believed in God, in a personal and providential God. And though this helped him at times to sort of resolve some of the tension in life, it also kind of made it worse. After all, if God is there, and if he cares, then why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel so lost? Why do I feel so clueless at times? One writer put it this way, describing the book of Ecclesiastes. He said, the book of Ecclesiastes often reads like the diary of despair, sometimes portraying life as a sick joke with death as the punchline. And we as Christians go, gosh, that is kind of how that feels. That doesn't feel like a Christian, though. And yet we know Christians who feel that same way. And that's why I think this book is so important, because it's written from a perspective of belief and yet still curiosity and confusion. Again, to some Christians, this doesn't sound like the posture of a believer, but the truth is, belief in God doesn't mean all our riddles are answered and tensions resolved. What it means is that you understand yourself to not be God, and therefore incapable of knowing all of the answers to everything, but believing that there is someone who does. And that is consolation enough to continue moving forward. So again, it's important to understand the author was a believer. He's an anonymous writer. He is a believer. He's not an atheist. He's not an agnostic. Over the centuries, various thinkers have struggled at understanding the meaning of life. But not all of them have done so with this belief that God exists, that he is personal and providential. I just read a book recently on various thinkers and philosophers over the last few years. The most notable, of course, is one you've already heard from, a recent one. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a German philosopher who famously coined the expression, the death of God. There was a movie and a book put out just a few years ago called God is Not Dead. Well, that's sort of counter to this guy's statement, the death of God. Nietzsche is also credited with the belief of nihilism, which essentially teaches that, again, because God doesn't exist, nothing has any intrinsic value or meaning or purpose. And there is no basis for any normative ethical views or morality, which makes sense because if there is no God, then there is no standard of morality. There is no ultimate judge. There is no ultimate purpose. Everything just is what it is. The only thing, the only reason why purpose exists is because we apply it to it. It's what we think purpose is. There's only one problem. We know that things have value. That doesn't make sense. It has value even outside of what we attribute to it as valuable. So there are people who have tried to seek meaning and purpose and understanding in the world and do it apart from God, but they end up in even more confusion. So I think, again, it's important that we understand this guy was not an ancient nihilist. He wasn't some existential atheist. That's not what he was doing. He's far from that. Instead, what the book is challenging every person in search for meaning with is this: how do I make sense of this confusing world and my mortality with the existence of an eternal and providential God? I want to share one more thing, and then we'll get into the text, which is why we decided to go through this series in the fall of 2024. Why go through a book like this? Well, first, because I studied the book last summer and I studied it last fall, and I had a bunch of information and I just wanted to share it. So it's really all about me. Not really. The more important thing is because I think there's a great temptation right now among Christians to seek purpose, meaning, value, identity in things that ultimately won't last. They're vanity. Right now, you and I are looking at a world, and maybe we're participating in it, where everyone is fighting for things they cannot hold on to. They're fighting for some utopia, some like arrival point that they think they can get in this world, but they can't. Right now, politicians are vying for more and more power. Businesses are fighting for more and more money. The media is striving for more and more influence over the masses, which if you just take a step back and think about it for just a second, it makes no sense, because one day, these people are going to die. Absolutely. Thank you. I see some of these politicians, and they're dinosaurs. I mean, they are just ancient. And they are just more, and it's like, it's insane. And don't think I'm judging these people. I'm not. Because we all do that. They're just further down the line than we are. That's the insanity that we need to avoid, and a book like this is going to help us to do that. One day, you're going to die just like everyone else, and in no time at all, no one's going to remember you. No one's going to remember the impact that you had, the bill that you wrote in Congress. No one's going to remember that business transaction you made. No one's going to care. No one's going to care. Somehow, some way, we do these things because we think it's going to provide meaning or purpose or make some impact on the world, but in the end, it's all just as empty as ever. Now, for the non-Christian that you know, maybe for the person who doesn't believe in God yet that's in this room right now, that, what I just said right there, that reality is a suffocating experience. It is that weight on your chest that you live with every single day, feeling like life doesn't matter. And it forces people to do one of two things, these two extremes: despair of life in general, or live it however you want. If nothing matters, then do whatever you want. For the Christian, though, I think this is the big change, that it's actually liberating. It sets you free. The truth that one day I'm going to die and nothing I do or achieve or acquire matters all that much except what I do for God in the life that I have been given. It frees me up to put value, the right kind of value, in the things that I have all around me, and not put a certain kind of value in them that they really can't. It helps me to take joy in everything, every moment, every relationship that I have for what it is, a gift from God, nothing I've earned, achieved, or deserved. So the starting point of this book is this: that everything is vanity, life is short, it's like a mist, it's here one day, it's gone the next, and it really had no lasting impact on the world. And the moment you think you have it all figured out is the moment that you lose it from your fingertips. And he explains that in verses 4 through 11. That's his point, and then he argues his point. He says, hey, here's some examples of what I'm talking about. And he gives this poem with various proofs. And the proof can be summarized in this way, at least this is his initial proof. Everything changes, and at the same time, nothing changes. If you can explain to me how that works, then you've figured out the book of Ecclesiastes. But the one thing that never changes is that everything changes. Again, how does that make sense? But that's life in a world that we're living in, where we don't see the whole thing. One author put it this way. He said this: we long for change in a world of permanent repetition, and we dream of how to interrupt it. We long for lives of permanence in a world of constant change, and we strive to achieve it. That's the struggle. And that's the struggle the author is expressing. Just look again at verses 4 through 7. We'll just read the first few lines of the poem here. A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they will flow again. It's like right there in front of you, the simple and profound truth that everything changes and nothing changes. And notice first he mentions that a generation comes and a generation goes. And each time this happens, as we look back over history, it barely seems like we're making any progress at all, generation to generation. We can look back and be like, whoa, look at these advances in science and medicine and technology and industry. Look at all these advances. Certainly we're going somewhere. But then you ask the question, but are we better off as people? Are we happier? Are we more fulfilled? Do we have more answers, both personally and socially? And I think the answer is actually the opposite. We don't. We're less happy. We're less fulfilled. And from here, he points to nature. He writes, the sun rises, the sun sets, and it does it again. Every day the same. The wind blows from north to south, from south to north, and around it goes. It makes no progress and no advancement at all, which is an interesting observation. We live in a Western society, and a Western society typically sees time, our relationship to time, we see it as linear. The day we're born, the day we die, and there's this line in between. And along that line is events. And when we're born, we grow up thinking about these, we think about points of arrival. As we grow up, we think about that day. And whatever that day is to you. When you're young, you're like, dude, that day I get my driver's license, and I got freedom from my parents, and I can go wherever I want. Or that day that I graduate from high school, that day that I graduate from college, then I'll finally have some answers and I'll finally arrive at this place of meaning and purpose. Maybe it's the day that I have kids, the day that I get married. Now I'll finally be fulfilled. Or that day when I retire, the day that I make tenure on my job, the day I pay off my house, whatever that day is. We're always in pursuit of that thing. Oh, that's the horizon that I'm getting to. And you know what happens? It's a false horizon. Because once we arrive at that horizon, there's another horizon. And that's so crushing when that happens. But what the author is saying is that time is not so much linear. If you just look around, it's actually circular, like the hands on a clock. They just go around and around and around again. So does the sun, so does the wind, so does the waters and the oceans and the streams, back again. And what's his point? He says it there in verse 9, what has been is what will be again, and there is nothing new under the sun. We struggle because mankind has this internal impulse for the eternal. We'll see that more in chapter 3. But because we're made in the image of God, and the likeness of God, we want our lives to matter because we know that our lives matter because God made us that way. We're made in His image. We want our lives to have an impact on the world. We want to know that our names and the effect of our lives will continue long after we are gone. And though there are some people who are able to achieve at least a form of that, the truth remains nothing they did added or took away from what has already been done or was there. I think this longing for impact, for this eternal significance, and it's in every single person, again, comes from our being made in the image of God. The problem is that we're all fallen. We're all broken. We're all impacted by sin. And so this eternal longing for significance is often expressed in less than holy ways. So we want things to change. We want to know we have an impact, but there's another side of this that's just as troubling, that just as much as we wish things could change, but they often don't, we also wish that some things would never change, but they often do. Again, what does he say? A generation comes and goes. The sunset that you looked at last night, that beautiful sunset, it's going to be gone. It's a different one the next day. The water in that stream that you drank from, that you remembered as a kid, it just doesn't taste the same when you get older. People often say things like this: I wish this moment would last forever. And why do we say that? Because that moment's really sweet. But we know it doesn't last forever. But we wish that it could. When you're young, all you want to do is grow up and be able to do those things. But when you get older, you kind of want time to freeze, maybe even go back and do it all over again. But this proves the general point that the author is making, that all is vanity. That whatever you're chasing, like a mist, like a vapor, right when you think you have it, right when you think you have it all figured out, right when you think you've arrived at that place that you think you need to get to, it slips through your fingers and it fades from your eyes. At the end of the day, our struggle in discovering life's meaning and ultimate purpose is really in this, that we are just merely creatures. Mortal men and women, finite beings with a limited capacity of time and space. And you know what? That really bugs us. It bugs us that we are not God. It bugs us that we're not in control. Is that not what bothered Adam and Eve in the garden? They had everything. It was perfect, flawless. And you know what they didn't have? But I'm not that guy. And that desire was awakened with the temptation. And he's like, dude, if you just eat that thing, you'll get what you want. And so they took it and they ate it. And the effect of that is what brought sin and suffering and death into the world. That root desire continues to live in all of us, and it continues to bear the same fruit today: despair, destruction, and discouragement. But let me go back to something I said earlier as I wrap this up. The preacher is not writing from the perspective that God doesn't exist. Instead, what makes this book so challenging is that it is true both for the unsaved and the saved, primarily for the saved. We want to think the opposite, though, right? As Christians, we want to believe that the Christian way of looking at life is different than what is being presented before us here in this book, more hopeful, perhaps, even slightly more optimistic. And though it is true that knowing Christ does give a whole new angle for us to see and know the true purpose of life, being a Christian doesn't change the reality that life continues to not make sense of us. Rather, what it does is it makes us the first people to stop pretending that it does. That's the fact. What the author is seeking to prove throughout this book is that accepting things as they are, that life is short, that our worldly pursuits will not give us what we hope they will, and that one day we're all going to die and stand and face God, only then, the author is saying, are you really prepared to live, to enjoy and understand life. This truth, I believe, was both embraced and lived out flawlessly by Jesus. Who is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes? The son of David. And what was Jesus? The son of David. I mean, you could almost say Jesus wrote this book. He didn't, but you could almost say he did. Because this was Jesus' experience in the world, right? Jesus embraced and lived out every moment of his life flawlessly. When he came into the world, he lived and enjoyed every day to the full. He fully immersed himself in his relationships. He loved, he spoke truth, he laughed, he cried, he faced the hard things with courage and patience. He worked, he played, he didn't waste a moment. And how was he able to do this? Why was he able to do this? The reason was because he knew life was short and that someday, sooner than later, he was going to die. And because he knew his mission was to give his life as a ransom for the world, he chose to live every day with maximum joy and maximum impact. And think about that for a moment. Because he approached that life that way, this poor man from Galilee who lived 2,000 years ago actually kind of broke the rules of the game. Because the rules of the game is this: your life is not going to make maximum impact. And yet Jesus, because he lived by this, continues to impact the world for God and change and transform lives. Jesus, along with dying in our place and giving us hope in the dark and confusing world, taught us how to live in it until that day, the day that we stand before God. That's the ultimate arrival point. And the lesson he taught us was this: stop pretending that life isn't short and start living like it is. Enjoy life as God's gift to you and trust that God has a plan for it all. As we go through this book, we're going to see more and more and more of this argument laid out. It is going to take great courage to go through the book of Ecclesiastes because it is just reality smack in your face. And we don't like that too often, but it's the only way to live. So why don't we pray to that end, and as we prepare ourselves for communion as well. God, we come before you, and one of the things that we confess to you, God, that oftentimes we like to push reality away and live in these imaginatory fantasy lands. We don't want to think about the realities of the world in which we live and the feelings that we have about it. But your word here is so bold, so kind, as to bring up the conversation with us in order to help us in this life and to live it for you and to live it with joy and purpose. And I pray, God, that you would give us the courage that we need, the grace that we need, the faith that we need to see what we cannot see, but to believe you and to trust in you even more. God, I pray that as we think about your son Jesus revealed in this book, that God, he would become more real, more relevant to us, and we would become more and more like him. And we pray this in his name.